Good evening, everyone. I'm Neil Lane. I'm a fellow at the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here for tonight's talk, which will be given by Professor Michael DePledge on novel materials in the environment, the case of nanotechnology. This event brings together the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program, which Dr. Kirsten Matthews and I work with, and Rice University's International Council on Nanotechnology, or ICON, to discuss a recent report released by the British Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. Support for this evening's event was generously provided by the UK Science and Innovation section of the British Consulate General in Houston and Bracewell and Giuliani, and we are very grateful for their support. Tonight's lecture, as many of you know, is part of a two-day workshop hosted by ICON, which is titled Advancing the Eco-Responsible Design and Disposal of Engineered Nanomaterials. The goal of the workshop is to develop methods for the design and disposal of nanomaterials that protect the environment and public health. Of course, what's so special about nanomaterials is they're really tiny. Clinton used to call this tiny little initiative. But the thing is, with dimensions of that size, you have enormous power to do things that we otherwise have not been able to do. And therein lies the promise of nanotechnology. But the other thing about those tiny little things is they move around in the environment in ways we don't entirely understand, but we need to. So that is, in large part, what these events are all about. When I was in Washington in the late 1990s, I worked for President Clinton as his science advisor, and I had the privilege of advising him on the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which he announced in the year 2000. The NNI, which coordinates about $1.5 billion in R&D programs of many of the federal agencies, fortunately received very strong backing from industry and also bipartisan support in the Congress. So President Bush embraced the initiative, and the budget continued to do well. The NNI also provides a kind of a focal point for information and, at least symbolically, a vision of the future benefits of nanotechnology. But as with all new technologies, there are downsides as well, and we have to understand those as best we can, and that requires industry and government and other organizations to work together so that these risks are minimized. The vision for nanotechnology, so maximizing the good while minimizing any possible harm, led to the creation of the organizing institution for tonight's event, ICON. Since some of you in the audience may not know a lot about ICON, let me give you a little background. It's based at Rice University. It's a technically driven organization, broadly supported by industry, nonprofit foundations, and governments. ICON grew out of Rice University's Center for Biological and Environmental Nanotechnology, CBEN, which has been designated by the United States National Science Foundation, a very good government agency, I might add, as a nanotechnology center of excellence. CBEN has played and continues to play a central role in building an international community of researchers who seek to understand nanotechnology's risks and benefits. Rice is fortunate to have both of these organizations as key components of Rice's world-class research and development activities in this area. ICON is an international, multi-stakeholder organization whose mission is to develop and communicate information regarding potential environmental and health risks of nanotechnology, thereby fostering risk reduction and maximizing societal benefit. The goal of ICON is to help provide sound science-based information about nanomaterials in a form that can guide policy decision-making to advance technological progress in an environmentally responsible manner that balances the needs of all the stakeholders. ICON encourages stakeholders from government, industry, academia, non-governmental organizations from all around the world to come together and determine the best practices and maintain and regulate nanomaterials and technology wherever necessary. The notion of scientists getting involved in the policy process is embodied in what we here at the Baker Institute call the civic scientist. We have a civic scientist program with annual lectures, and we define a civic scientist as a scientist or an engineer, mathematician, a technical professional who not only is an accomplished professional, but who also takes advantage of his or her knowledge, experiences, skills, fame, whatever, to reach out to the public, to help the public understand the advances in science and technology, just the excitement of discovery, the satisfaction that comes from inventing things that actually improve people's lives. That's what civic science is all about, but it requires our researchers to step outside their laboratories, outside the hedges of the campus, and interact more broadly with the larger community. Good news is there are many civic scientists in this country and around the world. Rice's late and great Rick Smalley was a terrific example that I'm often pleased to use of a civic scientist, because he used not only his knowledge and experience, but his fame as a Nobel laureate to try to wake up people to the coming problems in energy and the very real promise that emerging technologies like nanotechnology will offer us solutions. And our speaker tonight, Professor Michael DePledge, is a civic scientist who's traveled from the UK to join us to tell us about the findings and the recommendations of the Royal Commission. Professor DePledge will be introduced by Dr. May Akrawi, Vice Consul and Head of the Science and Innovation Program at the British Consulate General Houston and a good friend of Rice, Baker Institute. Please welcome May.
Thank you, Neil, for that kind introduction, and to you and Kirsten for always being such good friends to the UK Science and Innovation section and for hosting this evening. And thanks also to CBAN and ICON and all of the chairs of the workshop that are making these 2 days possible. We're very, very pleased to be part of this, and this all really started back meeting Professor DePledge at the Royal Society and learning about their report and offering the services of our science network. So our group is the Science and Innovation Network at the Foreign Office, and we're posted at about 45 consulates and embassies around the world to help UK policymakers get the best scientific advice and share with them some of the best practices that are going on around the world and help with such studies, as well as work on facilitating international research collaborations and promote UK science. And Rice and other universities in Texas have been great partners for us. But what is really a pleasure is actually being part as a scientist for me and helping to provide sound scientific advice to government, because I know the UK government really values the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution's role because it's an independent body that's an arm away from government with such eminent scientists as Mike and others that do this at their own time. This is not a full-time job to provide this advice and guidance, and they've provided several reports from climate change to the impact of aviation on pollution and many others that are available on their website. I wanted to introduce Mike, who has also become a very good friend as well as colleague. And I also encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to chat with him, to also follow up on some of his own research, because I know he's very keen to have interactions with universities in the US and Texas and have some postdoctoral exchanges, and we can help to support some of these. So Mike started his studies at the University of London, a very eminent university, I might add, at Westfield College, getting his first-class honors degree in biological sciences, and then PhD in toxicology of marine organisms, and he was later awarded a DSc as well. And just to summarize some of the professorships he's held, he's been at Hong Kong, Harvard, Denmark, to name but a few, and he's also been an advisor to the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, and the WHO, and is currently Chair of Environment and Human Health at the Peninsula Medical School, which is part of Exeter and Plymouth universities in the UK. And he's also chair of the Science Advisory Committee on Environment and Climate Change for the European Commission's Director General for Research in Brussels, board member of Natural England, and he also served as Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK's Environment Agency, a role that was much, much appreciated. So without further ado, I present Professor Mike DePledge.
Hello, thank you very much indeed, Neil and May, and thank you all for coming to this lecture tonight. It's an absolute delight to see you all here and to have the chance to tell you something about the Royal Commission's report. We came to Texas about a year ago, I think it was, and gathered evidence here for the report that I'm going to be telling you about tonight. And I just want to say that never have we been made more welcome and shown greater hospitality anywhere in the world, I think, than coming here. So thank you very much for that. The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution needs a little bit of explaining. It's an unusual organisation. It was set up in 1970, and it was set up by Parliament at the request, allegedly, of the Queen, who takes great interest in these matters, we think. And so it's been in existence for quite a long time. And we currently have 9 members, although we're trying to get it back up to 14, which we normally have. And it's produced a number of reports over the years that have been, I think, rather influential. It's completely independent, so we can say whatever we want. It's not a group of experts in the sense that if you had a committee looking at some chemical like or endocrine disruptors, it's not a committee like that where you bring together endocrine disrupting specialists who would then give you a clear idea of what the problem is. It's more a group of individuals who are expert in their own field who are brought together to consider evidence which is presented to them and try and say something sensible or innovative about it. So the Royal Commissioners, in fact, are lawyers, economists, chemists, mathematicians, medics, all kinds of people who have been eminent in their field but are brought together to consider this evidence. Now, the Novel Materials Report is the 27th report of the Royal Commission. And we began looking at the evidence to make some comments about how novel materials might impact the environment. We started looking about 2 years ago. And indeed, we went to many places in the world, obviously to Texas, but we also went to Washington and gathered evidence there. We went to Belfast, we went to Japan, we went to Brussels, and many places around the UK to pick information up from over 100 different organisations have contributed information to our study. I should just first of all say, though, that the idea of novel materials is very old, paradoxically. And this picture here with a cup on the front of the Royal Commission's report, this is the Lycurgus cup that is thought to have been made in Rome in about 4 AD. And it's one of the, in fact, it is the only complete example of dichroic glass. And you can see that this glass has a green tinge. But when you hold it up to the light, it turns red. And is really quite beautiful. And it does that because it contains silver and gold nanoparticles. So it's a very old subject indeed, as you can see, that we're dealing with here. Now, a little more then about the Royal Commission. We've done 26 reports, as I say, and the novel materials one is the 27th. And the exciting thing about it is that when we produce these reports, they actually go to Parliament, and the government has to make an official response to them. So they don't just accumulate on shelves, they're actually a subject of debate. And over the years, I think they've been quite influential. Very often not at the time that the reports were produced, but if you look over a few years afterwards, 5, 10 years afterwards in some cases, the government normally adopts the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So it was the Royal Commission that suggested to government that lead be taken out of petrol in the UK, and within a matter of a month and a half, the government made that order. It was also the Royal Commission that suggested that there should be a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and this too was adopted by the government, although of course it's taken a little bit of time and we don't seem to be quite keeping up, so now we're up to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emission. So the point is that these reports are taken rather seriously. So, sorry, those are just a few examples of reports, and if anybody wants to get them, you can download them now as PDFs from the web. Now, note that the report title is Novel Materials. It's not nanomaterials, it's novel materials. So when we embarked on this endeavour, what we thought was that we would be able to gather evidence about an enormous range of novel materials and novel uses of materials to review and consider and think what their environmental implications might be and what their human health impact might be. And of course we wanted to balance those negative impacts with the positive benefits that you could use these novel materials for in cleaning up the environment, improving health and so on. So we wanted to get a balanced approach. But as it turned out, the evidence that we received almost entirely concerned nanomaterials. There didn't seem to be much interest talking about rare metals, things like yttrium and hafnium and these metals that are used in things like mobile phones in increasing amounts. Nobody really wanted to talk about that kind of thing. And we came to the conclusion that many of the new substances that were being manufactured, or many of the rare metals that were starting to be used, really could probably be evaluated and dealt with using conventional toxicity testing methods. But when we came to the nanomaterials, we were very clear that something odd was going on, something different was going on. These materials had properties that were very different to the bulk form of the substances. So, for example, nano gold behaves profoundly differently to bulk gold or bulk silver. The same story applies. So, therefore, we decided that we would use as an illustrative example for our novel materials report the evidence that could be accumulated on nanomaterials. You can see from this picture that innovation is leading increasingly to the production of all kinds of new things. So these are trends in patents from 1990 to 2006, and there's an ever-increasing number of materials that are being produced, and in particular nanomaterials. There's a huge proliferation of them. The types of materials that are produced are incredibly variable. So when we use the term nanotechnology, it refers to an enormous range of technologies. So that's something that's quite difficult to deal with when you're trying to think of ways of regulating and testing and assessing these materials. I guess that if I were to summarize the three key points that we were concerned with during the course of our investigations, they would be, firstly, the profound ignorance that we have about nanomaterials, about their toxicology, about their fate in the environment and their impact on human health. Profound ignorance. We were also very concerned about the fact that, in some cases at least, the bulk forms of chemicals have been tested toxicologically, and that meant that the nanoforms were getting a free pass. People were assuming that the bulk and the nanoforms could be evaluated in the same way at the same moment, and we've thought that that was a grave error. And finally, we were particularly concerned about third and fourth generation nanomaterials, where nanomaterials get combined with other technologies, when we get into self-assembly and all of these things, which seem to be coming through. It seems to be planned in the future. And we just don't know what the likely impact of those will be in the environment. Now, just to talk a little more about the different sectors in which nanomaterials are produced, you can see here that there are an enormous number of sectors. I don't seem to have a pointer, but I guess you can read for your... If I leave there, you won't hear me, so I'll stay here. You can see that mechanical engineering, electronic engineering, physical chemistry, all kinds of different areas, pharmacology, are producing nanomaterials. Lots of nanomedicines coming onto the market currently. And you can see in the economic sectors that the electronics industry, automobiles, food industry, textiles, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, they're all involved in this endeavor, creating this wealth of materials with extremely interesting and new properties. And of course, that's why we're making them, because they're so interesting, because they can do new things. There used to be an advertisement on British television about a beer that when you drink it, it can reach parts of the body that other beers can't reach. And this was a selling point. Well, the same may well be true of nanomaterials. They seem to reach parts of cells that other bits and pieces don't seem to get to. So there are concerns about where they actually can arrive at. There doesn't seem to be a simple system by which we can look at these products. However, it is extraordinary to me that, as the Woodrow Wilson Center has pointed out, there are now at least 600 nano products on the market. 600 products that have been through conventional toxicity testing procedures, are deemed to be safe, and have been put out onto the market. It's interesting to reconcile that fact with the knowledge that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is currently developing a whole load of new toxicity test procedures and evaluation procedures specifically for use with nanomaterials. So I think it's kind of implicit there that whilst we're currently relying on conventional tests, they're not very reliable for dealing with nanomaterials. Hence, we are developing new tests specifically for dealing with nanomaterials. So how confident can we be that the 600 products that are already on the market truly are safe? I leave that for you to contemplate. Now, there are many ways of evaluating or classifying nanomaterials and trying to get some kind of order into the assessment. But what we rapidly concluded from the evidence that we received at the Royal Commission was that it wasn't worth trying to classify nanomaterials on the basis of their different sizes or shapes particularly. The thing that was really, really interesting was the functionality. What do these things do and how do they do it? And can we classify them on the basis of their functionality? Materials on the nanoscale have radically enhanced and different properties. There are all kinds of novel properties emerge from their small size, surface volume ratios, from the fact that there are surface properties that come to the fore that we haven't seen before. And this means that they're unpredictable in all kinds of ways too. Because they spring up one novel material, one novel property under certain circumstances, we can see that in other circumstances they do something quite unusual, quite unpredictable, and that, of course, is interesting from the point of view of developing new products, but it's also of concern because if they get into the environment or if they get into human beings, are they going to start doing unpredictable and novel things? Having said all of those things, and perhaps been a little bit scary about the way that I've mentioned some of the unknowns, let me talk about something that we did conclude in the report. And after doing a very extensive review of the literature, and we brought experts in to review the literature for us, and you can see their report on our website, and after extensive discussions with the people who gave us the evidence, we concluded as a commission that there is no evidence currently that nanomaterials cause harm to human health or the environment. There is no evidence at the moment. But what does that mean? Let's unpack that statement for a moment. We also concluded that would we know if nanomaterials were causing harm? And the answer is no, we wouldn't. At the moment, we don't have techniques for monitoring nanomaterials escaping into the environment. We can't tell where they are. We can't routinely monitor their fate or their chemical transformations. We don't know how long they persist. And since they have novel properties, we don't know what kind of novel damage they might do. We might be able to detect the more conventional things that they do, generating reactive oxygen species, causing some kind of damage in that way, or maybe nanotubes causing some kind of physical damage like asbestos fibers. We might be able to detect that. But what if they start getting to parts of organisms that they haven't been in, or to different kinds of organisms? What if they interact with pollutants already in the environment? How on earth will we be able to detect these new effects and attribute them to nanomaterials? I think it's also worth pointing out that whilst there's no evidence that manufactured or engineered nanomaterials are causing any problem in the environment at the moment, we do know that naturally produced nanomaterials, and there are many produced, for example, there are PAH nanoparticles produced naturally. There are all kinds of particles in dust and so on, that some of them at the nano scale. And we know from US EPA that at least 60,000 deaths per year can be attributed to exposure to natural nanoparticles. So that's kind of interest too. So here we are then working essentially in ignorance. There's very limited or no toxicological information on many of the new nanomaterials being produced. For example, C60, one of the commonest, nanosilver, nanotubules. We just don't have a sufficient amount of information. The properties of nanomaterials are quite difficult to the bulk form, as I've said, and managing nanomaterials in the face of ignorance poses the biggest challenge that we have in this area. Having said all of those things, again, we don't feel there's a case for a blanket ban. In some parts of the world, Europe, in some parts of Europe even, there are people who suggest that since we are ignorant about what nanomaterials could do, that we ought to adopt the precautionary principle and put a blanket ban on. After considering these areas, the Royal Commission felt that this was not a good idea, that it would inhibit progress, that there are all kinds of benefits to be gained from nanomaterials, and it wouldn't be justified on balance on depriving people from the benefits of nanomaterials because of concern over what they might do in a negative sense. We do think, though, that based on the functionality of nanomaterials, what they're designed to do, where they're produced, where they're likely to get to in terms of their use, that we might be able to come up with a priority list. And today at the workshop, and half of you are from the workshop, and you must be fed up of hearing what I'm saying because we discussed all of these things once already today. But I think it's quite clear that we need to come up with some way of prioritizing the different nanomaterials to test and to evaluate. Some of the nanomaterials have been around quite a long time now, and they don't seem to be doing anything particularly drastic that we've seen with the caveats that I put earlier. But there are some nanomaterials that are designed to be extremely active, catalytic, and those are ones that we might be concerned about. Some are produced in very large amounts, like the nanomaterials you find in sunscreens that you wear, and they too may be, well, hopefully they're inert, but we don't know where they go in the environment and what they do, and they may be being introduced at quite a high rate for example, on beaches and so on, and will be for many years to come probably. So there's a real need to look at the priorities for testing, we feel. Now, although we don't feel there is any evidence at the moment of damage by nanomaterials to the environment and human health, if you collect together the data that's been acquired in the laboratory, particularly over the last 5 years, then what you can see is, although the amount of data available in total is not great, there are examples of nanomaterials in laboratory situations causing damage to just about every group of organisms you can think of. So microorganisms, plants of different kinds, algal cells, whole plants, have been shown to, when exposed to nanomaterials of different kinds, suffer cellular damage, damage to DNA, damage to structure and function. And that goes all the way through a few of the invertebrate phyla that have been tested, and into the vertebrates and through to the mammals. So it is certainly plausible that nanomaterials can cause damage. And that was another one of the major kind of conclusions of our report. We were concerned to find that there is virtually no data on long-term exposure to nanomaterials. We just don't know what's happening there. We don't know how nanomaterials entering into ecosystems would produce disturbances in ecosystems to nutrient cycling or biodegradation, to population and community, population dynamics and community structure. We don't know how nanomaterials might interfere with the interactions among organisms, and that was of great concern. And so having said that, we felt that it would be wise to advise regulatory agencies and environmental agencies such as US EPA and the Environment Agency in the UK that really there was a need for developing monitoring techniques and actually getting out there and looking for unexpected effects in the environment. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. This is, I found the thing, it was right in front of me. There we are. Does it work? Yes, it does. This is a graph that I came across working with Igor Linkov at a NATO workshop on nanomaterials. And I think it demonstrates what happens with nano, but what happens with all novel products coming into the marketplace. What seems to happen, and this is kind of a hypothetical thing, but I think it describes the situation. You start off with a new emerging technology, novel materials, nano products or whatever, and they flood the market as they come on. People use the novelty, they make new products, they're flooded onto the marketplace, and we buy them because we love the new things that they can do. We then start to think, just a minute, this might not be a good idea. We don't know where these things end up and what they can do. This isn't just nano, this is novel, anything that's novel. And then we start to generate data. And there's a gap, there's a lag, it lags behind. And finally, that data is put into the hands of regulatory agencies who try and make some sense of it and come out with a formalized system that then results in some kind of testing. And this time period, we think, is very often in the order of 10 to 15 years. So with nano, we might be another 5, 10, 15 years away from having a reasonable regulatory system in place. One that really does confer some safety. So how do you manage what happens in the gap? And this is, I think, where the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution is really breaking into what we feel is new ground, in a sense, by presenting this information to government, to the British government, and happily also to the European Commission. Because to live in this gap is to live in a period where we are not perhaps protected in the way that we would like to be. And it does really challenge us to come up with new paradigms of how you would actually manage the situation in this gap period. And that's not going to be a question of science stepping in and delivering all the solutions. It's going to be a combination of science, of policy, of industry taking responsibility in new ways. And I think that that is probably the most important outcome, in a sense, of our report. Now, there are pre-existing regulations in Europe, and probably you've heard of the REACH regulations. I can never remember what it stands for, but I will just tell you. I always remember it as REACH, because it stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemical Substances. And if you work that out, that's REAROCS, which is REAROCS. But they didn't like that, so they called it REACH. And the REACH regulations are designed to apply to all the chemicals that are used in industrial manufacture. Maybe 100,000 chemicals are out there, 30,000 of them in common use. We've probably only done toxicity testing so far on about 3,500 of them, so there's a little way to go. If you then take all the nanomaterials that we are about to produce, it's going to be a long time before we actually get to test them all. and do something about it. However, it does seem that the principle is fine, that you can actually use the REACH procedures, especially if we design in better toxicity test methods to evaluate nanomaterials. There's one slight problem in the REACH regulations, and that is that you don't have to notify if you're only producing about a ton of the material, and a ton of nanomaterial is quite a lot of material. So it could sneak in under the radar, as it were. But now I think the European Commission is aware of that, and they will modify the REACH regulation appropriately. Probably I won't dwell any more on that. So where are we then? We have to get to the place where we develop some flexible arrangements and some novel arrangements for the management of novel materials, in our case now, nanomaterials. The Commission has proposed a kind of a basket of measures that could be taken. Certainly we need more toxicological information, more structural characterization, and all the things that we've been talking about at the ICON workshop today. But in addition, we suggest that there is a compulsory checklist as part of an early warning system, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the moment, the checklist to be used by industry and others. We think that the government, the UK government, should impose a legal duty on companies to report suspicious findings. So very often in the past we've seen that chemical companies, different kinds of companies manufacturing new materials, novel materials, get a little bit of evidence from their work that something may be a little bit dangerous or maybe doing something unexpected. And rather than reporting that openly, that's kept quite confidential. This cannot stand. We've got to change this around. Another thing that we're very keen on is environmental monitoring. We were talking today about not knowing where many of the nanoparticles might end up, but we do know where many of the products end up that contain nanoparticles. And if we direct our monitoring efforts in the environment to where products end up with nanomaterials in, it might give us a flying start to try and detect where the early effects are occurring. Another thing that we recommended, and I have to say that the Royal Commission has two of the, in my view, the best social scientists in the world. So when they tell me that one-off public engagement projects are really shown to be largely a waste of time, I believe them. We need a much more sophisticated means of interacting to gather social intelligence from different sectors in society, to inform people, to get their opinion, to have a debate in society. And we've enumerated this or explained this rather clearly, I think, in the full version of the report, which I'm afraid I haven't got time to go into now, but it's important. I mentioned the checklist that people might put in place. We think that it's a good idea to have a checklist, and we need the government and people to work on this because this is just a recommendation. A checklist that the manufacturer can have a look at and see what is it that they need to be looking for in their nanomaterial that we're worried about. So is it highly catalytic? Is it going to be used in large amounts? Is it going to be persistent in the environment? Is it going to be embedded in something, or is it going to be free in the environment? Those kind of questions. So we propose having a rather simple checklist, but nonetheless it will provoke the people who are manufacturing these things to think carefully about it. All importers and manufacturers of nanomaterials are not covered by REACH, and this brings me to, I think, what is an enormously important point. In our deliberations at the workshop today, we've talked about all the kind of sophisticated things that could be done in the US and in Europe and in Japan for assessing and dealing with nanomaterials. But that doesn't apply to other countries around the world, and I'm thinking particularly of China and India and maybe countries in South America. China in particular is very, very engaged in making products from nanomaterials, with a quite different perspective. Even in Japan, when the Commission went to Japan, and I'm being indelicate probably now, but the general thrust of things in Japan was probably even more developed than in the US, in the sense of they didn't want anything to get in the way of innovating with novel materials. And most of their public engagement program was about convincing the public that there is no problem with nanomaterials or any other novelty, and if one sprung up, they'd deal with it. So let's get on and do lots of nanomaterial things. So very different perspectives in different parts of the world. In some of the countries in the EU, as I've mentioned, there's a very strong drive to have the precautionary principle, ban nanomaterials and not do any more with them. So we got the full spectrum of evidence given to the Commission in that regard. And yeah, we said about reporting special properties. The urgent need for monitoring, we recommended, and this will be of less interest to you, which agencies should do it in the UK. Recommendations to the research councils, and I think this is a kind of an interesting one, and I'd be interested to know what Neil thinks about this in the US context. We have a number of different research councils in the UK, and I've recently, outside of the Royal Commission in my own right, been trying to write papers saying, isn't it fascinating that a couple of our research councils are giving out grants to rapidly develop nanomaterials, nanotechnologies, novel materials, very, very rapidly indeed. And then there's the other research councils are giving out grants to see what those new technologies might do to the environment and to human health and so on. It's not joined up. So this is something that I think we need to address in the UK. So one set of circumstances are promoting the kind of rapid development and deployment and financial rewards that might be given from nanomaterials, and on the other hand, we're spending money to look at what they might be doing inadvertently to the environment and health. And also, I wonder whether this is a problem in the US. We have a huge problem in the UK and in Europe that we've run out of toxicologists and ecotoxicologists. Very, very few are being trained. There are very few groups in the country, particularly in ecotoxicology, but also in toxicology. And if you go into bookshops now, into scientific bookshops in Britain, if you go and look for the toxicology section, there isn't one. So that's certainly changed from when I was at university. So we've made a recommendation to government that we should start training medical and environmental toxicologists, and that recommendation is being adopted across Europe at the moment. We think there's a need for an ongoing dialogue, and I've said that we need to think of new ways of engaging with the public. And now I'm happily for you at the end, and we're near to having our refreshments. Well, I did just want to mention to you very briefly that this report by the Royal Commission has, I've only been able to just scan through a few of the things today, but it's been very impactful in the UK, at least. So we think. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is a full report. It's not too big to read. It's got the green cup on the front and the red cup on the back, so that's kind of nice. But in November, when we launched this report, within the month, 62,000 copies were downloaded from the website, and it's continuing at that kind of rate. So people seem to be at least interested in it, even if they don't agree with it. Although, generally speaking, people do seem to agree with it. We've had an awful lot of interest from the press, from the newspapers in the UK. We've had Sir John Lawton, who is the chair of the Royal Commission, who really should be here, but he sent his apologies. He couldn't be here, so he sent me. BBC Radio 4, we've had programmes on, so it's had an awful lot of interest in that regard. And yeah, maybe it's not always quite what the message we wanted to get over, but at least there is interest in it. This is an article in the Guardian newspaper that did attract quite a lot of attention. This wasn't our message, actually, but it was to promote awareness of the issues of nanomaterials and of novel materials, and of the role of science, and of the role of scientific information together with policy and together with regulation. And I know that's of interest to some people here. So at that point I will stop, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Recently, Canada announced that it was going to start a data call-in for nanomaterials, and they were setting a threshold of 1 kilogram, which perhaps is more appropriate than 1 ton. And California is also has a data call-in program for carbon nanotubes and is considering more extensive and comprehensive regulation at the state level. It seems to me that California and Canada might be serving potentially as harbingers of what's to come for nanoregulation. Do you see the Canadian regulatory statute and the pending California legislation as being potentially influential in the United Kingdom or more broadly in Europe?
Yes, I mean, I think the answer is yes. I think there will be. I think that as time goes on, it's likely we will be finding out much more about what nanomaterials can and can't do, which ones we should be concerned about, and so on. So I think it's on the agenda for the future, and I think that people will be looking elsewhere at what actions are taken, and I think the kind of more precautionary approach will probably rise a little, and they'll probably settle somewhere in the middle and adopt those kind of ideas. So I think it will be influential, yeah.
Mike, you mentioned that any reporting scheme that is enforced shouldn't be too onerous. And then I noticed the last bullet point on the same slide was, so therefore DEFRA should make its current reporting scheme mandatory, which is very onerous as it stands. So was there any suggestions about changes to that reporting scheme?
Yes, the message is that we want to, well, what we recommend is building a better consensus. What we're trying to do is say to the manufacturers of nanomaterials that you have a legal responsibility to report things that you find out, and you have a legal responsibility to start reporting the basic characteristics of what you're doing. Well, we don't think that that's going to be commercially sensitive in any way, but we do feel that it needs actually following up on. And for too long, for example, in other areas of environment, for example, in the water industry, if the water industry has an accident, then they actually report it to the Environment Agency and say, hey, we messed up, we did this. And they may or may not be prosecuted afterwards, probably in most cases are not prosecuted. And it's that kind of principle that we want to come into the nanotech and novel materials areas, because we want people to say, oh, we found this out and it's a bit worrying. But how we finesse it, happily the Royal Commission doesn't have to do that. But it needs a dialogue, and it needs to get the backing of industry. I think, just to bang on for a few seconds, it's intriguing that at the moment, most of the things that are done in complying with regulation are done because you kind of have to do it. But many companies around the world are actually take out insurance policies with the insurance industry or the reinsurance industry, in case somewhere down the line, off in the future, there's a major problem with their product. Now, what we've been trying to advocate as well is the fact that you can reduce your insurance premiums with the insurance companies if you voluntarily go and do an awful lot more work and evaluate the risk and provide more and more data. You can't do it comprehensively, but if you show willing and provide a lot more information, then it may be that that's reflected in a reduced insurance payment. So that's just one kind of scheme that we're exploring.
You mentioned that in Japan and China there are different policies on the attitude that's taken to the synthesis of nanomaterials. My understanding is that many of the nanomaterials that come to this country, or a fair share, come from overseas. Yeah. How do we deal with that issue when we're trying to look at potential regulatory issues and potential health effects?
Yeah, well, I think that any product that's going to contain nanomaterials coming from abroad, as it were, has to, at least in Europe, it will be subject to the same kind of restrictions. Nanomaterials that are going to be assembled in Europe will also have to be evaluated via the REACH process. So that's the general concept. But I do think, actually, it's a monumental challenge what's going to be going on in the rest of the world, outside the US, outside of Europe, with regard to whether we can have international agreements and persuade other nations to adopt the same kind of procedures that we are talking about.
When you mentioned about plausible damage, were you speaking of there's sign evidence, not causal evidence, or are you speaking less than that?
No, I was talking about the fact that when we take nanomaterials in a laboratory situation, expose them to cells, animal plant cells, microbes, or even to whole organisms in the laboratory, and there are lots of studies being done on fish and some polychaete worms and a whole variety of different organisms, even corals and so on. Then in laboratory settings, when you then look, I mean, I know it's not a realistic exposure, or we don't think it is, but you do see that the nanomaterials in some cases, in many cases, move into the cells or damage cell membranes, or they're disassembled outside the organism, but when they get into the organism, they reassemble inside. Those kind of things. And so when you get that evidence in the laboratory, it does make you stop and think that, well, if this stuff got out in the environment and accumulated in some particular place, like in sediment, you know, these are particles, maybe they're in sediment, and you get some sediment-dwelling snail that goes along munching sediment, then it's quite likely that, you know, it might get some of these nanoparticles, and then you're in the plausibility game. You know, we don't know that happens, but it doesn't seem entirely unreasonable. And until we get a little bit more information, then it's a cause for concern.
I was just wondering what the response of the manufacturers has been.
I don't have very much information about that, except in a few cases. I will tell you about one case in Japan, which was very encouraging, really. I won't say which company it was, but we did go and visit a very interesting company that made an awful lot of different kinds of nanomaterials. And one of the things that they were making was material out of nanofibers and so on. And we said to them, have you tested this, and are you concerned about it? And they said, no, it's all fine. It's all absolutely fine. And then we said, what happens when you put this shirt in a washing machine? Do any of the nanofibers abrade, and do they get discharged from the washing machine in the wastewater? And they said, oh, we hadn't thought of that, and we better start looking. But their reaction was, my goodness, we hadn't thought of that, we really want to look. And they were very open to suggestion, very responsive. So, yeah, that's my only example.
Considering the fact that there's a fairly large amount of cellular and organismic data that shows the toxicity of some kinds of materials based on their whatever, we have regulatory processes in the world, and especially in the U.S., and where we register compounds. Doesn't mean you can't use them, but you must register them. Do you see something like that in the future? Tosca, for instance.
Yeah.
Do you see something like that in the future?
Maybe that will have to be what goes on. I mean, one of the things that concerns me is the rate at which we're producing new materials, novel materials. Vicky Colvin, who's in the audience somewhere up there, was telling us today that, there are, what was it, 50,000 single-walled carbon nanotubules, for example, and then if you do all the different kinds of nanomaterials with things, and you're getting an awful lot of stuff. And I just don't know when we're going to be able to evaluate this stuff. Which doesn't exactly answer your question, but I mean sorry?
And what kind of data would you report? Well,
exactly right, and what would its significance be in terms of ecology and so on? I mean, I already, and I confess this now not as a commissioner, but as an ecotoxicologist, I am profoundly skeptical about the toxicity testing we already do with an algal cell, algae, water flea, fish. How one could imagine that Daphnia, the water flea, could actually represent 95% of animal species on the planet, the invertebrates, representing more than 33 phyla. Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch for me. Yeah.
Mike, you mentioned the recommendation about the need to better coordinate the research activities in different agencies. And of course, we know we don't do that very well here in the United States, but we assume the parliamentary system knows how to do that. You're saying there's room for improvement.
There's room for improvement, yeah.
And here, probably the best way that an agency like the National Science Foundation has found to at least start to get at this issue, and my colleagues will tell me if they agree, is through these centers programs, like CBEN, for example, where there's some funding and some flexibility and the need to pull together something of a community of people with diverse interests and expertise and so forth. But then you find the NSF, unless it's changed its mind, doesn't fund toxicology. So then the center has to form its relationships, its own partnerships, and that can be done, but you're all the time overcoming barriers that in principle could be lowered through wise policy moves. So, for example, a lot of the activity of EPA could be coordinated with the activity of NSF or other agencies to try to make the whole greater than the parts. We really have a hard time doing that, and part of it is because our whole government was put together because we didn't like the king, right? So we put together a system that makes it extraordinarily difficult to do this, and the Congress, of course, doesn't like this sort of business because they have their own interests in their own particular agencies with their specific missions. So we really have a long way to go, and I think we can learn from your experiences on how we might approach this problem ourselves.
I think we have some useful approaches, but I don't think we're kind of there yet. In fact, I will just go back. Do you know, I'm never going to give a talk like this again because I didn't prepare these slides, and it's the first time I've never prepared. They were prepared for me by the Commission Secretariat, so I'm looking at them and thinking, what the hell is that? So I'm sorry if it was a bit kind of clunky, but actually what I was looking for on here was one of the latest slides. Oh, here it is. I didn't even get to it. There you go. I just wanted to point out that Sir David King, who was Tony Blair's science advisor, did a number of very interesting things, one of which was to insist that in every government department in the UK, and sometimes it might seem illogical, you would have a person of this kind in it in some of the departments, but in every government department there was a chief scientist. And that also applied to government agencies like the Environment Agency, so I was one of those. And he gathered together the chief scientists in the Government Chief Science Advisors Committee, CSAC. Now I left that when I left the Environment Agency, but when we presented the Novel Materials Report to Parliament and the government was asked to make a response, it was actually handed to the Chief Scientific Advisors Committee. And they understood it, and they take it very seriously, and they understand the blend of science and policy and regulation that we were asking for. So we're extremely encouraged that it's kind of got to the right place. But going back to the issue of the Science Council, we tried really hard to join up the Environment Agency, Department of Environment, DEFRA, and the NERC, and failed pretty well. But it's an ongoing effort, and we will try and do that. One of the other things that I have personally been involved with since we couldn't make it happen in the UK was in Europe. We actually have a program called SCEP, which stands for Scientific Knowledge for Environmental Protection. And there we got the heads of science of every environment agency in each EU member state together in an organization to share their R&D programs, to share their horizon scanning, their ways of running projects, and so on and so forth. And that group of people interact now quite strongly with DG Environment, which is largely a policy area. It's by no means perfect, but the architecture is being put in place.
Maybe take another question.
Yep, okay, so one more.
You mentioned that one of the recommendations was prioritizing materials, and we all know the reasons why, it's the sheer numbers. And then you've kind of hinted at things like production numbers, if it's a kilogram versus a ton. Did the report actually give an example of this material A should be higher than this material B for a reason? Were there any specific examples that kind of highlight the general thinking that one would use?
Not specific examples, but it did highlight the kinds of properties that we felt were important. But maybe we should have done that. That would have been helpful. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm about done. I think.
One more question. Yeah,
oh, one more? Was there? No?
I've scared everybody to death.
Jamie, did you want to say?
Jamie has
something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Just a small housekeeping announcement for those people at the workshop. We've been very efficient today and got ahead of the schedule, so there's a slight change for tomorrow. Your reward for being so efficient is to do more work, I'm afraid. So we're starting at the normal time at 8 o'clock, but if you could form into the groups, the small working groups that we'd formed today, same groups will be working tomorrow, and with breakfast, if we could start at 8 o'clock and carry on those discussions that we left off tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie Lee. So that's our program this evening. Please join me in thanking our speakers.